I'm not hungry.
I cooked your favorite.
I changed my mind. I am going to bed.
You told me you would eat when you got home.
You want honesty? I don't like coming home and feeling like I'm being watched.
I don't watch you.
You're always waiting.
I'm your husband.
No. You're the man who lives in my house.
The words landed harder than she intended. Daniel looked away. Jane saw it. For a brief moment, something flashed across her face. Then it disappeared. I didn't mean. Yes, you did. Daniel walked toward the kitchen. Don't worry. I understand. Jane folded her arms. Good. The following morning, Daniel woke before her. He prepared coffee. He made breakfast. He placed Jane's medication beside her plate because she had forgotten it twice that week. When she came downstairs, she barely looked at him. Coffee? It's on the table. She sat down. Daniel placed a plate in front of her. You have your 9 o'clock meeting. I know. Your driver said the car is ready. I know. Daniel sat across from her. Are you still angry? He asked. Jane looked up. About what? Last night. She picked up her coffee. I forgot about it. Daniel gave a small laugh. No, you did not. Her eyes narrowed. What do you want me to say? Nothing. Then why bring it up? She asked. Because I don't know how to talk to you anymore. Jane put down her cup. You don't need to talk to me. He stared at her. What kind of marriage is that? The kind that works. Daniel shook his head. No, it's the kind that survives. She leaned back. You knew what you were getting into. I knew you were difficult. Difficult. Controlling. Her expression changed. Careful, Daniel. Daniel looked directly at her. See? That's exactly what I mean. What? You don't want a husband. You want someone who obeys you. Silence filled the dining room. Jane's jaw tightened. You're free to leave. Daniel looked at her. You say that every time. Because you keep complaining. I haven't left because. Daniel continued quietly. I keep thinking there's something underneath all of this. Jane stood. Don't. You don't trust people. Daniel, stop. You don't let anyone get close to you. Daniel continued. I said stop. Jane shouted. And whenever you feel like you're losing control, you push people away. Jane's chair scraped against the floor as she stepped back. You know nothing about me. I know enough. No, you don't. Her voice cracked. Daniel noticed. So did she. Jane immediately turned away. I have a meeting. She walked toward the door. Daniel followed her with his eyes. Jane. She stopped. I'm not your enemy, Daniel said. She didn't turn around. She just stood by the door for some moments before leaving.
If you are enjoying this story, do not forget to subscribe, like, and share. Now, let's continue with the story.
You're fired. 2 words, no warning, no wind-up, and the head of Monae Holdings' logistics division simply stopped talking mid-sentence. His mouth still open around a half-finished excuse for why a 9-figure shipment had vanished somewhere between Busan and Vancouver. Jane Monae didn't raise her voice. Security will escort you to collect your things, she said, already turning back to the tablet in her hand, already moving on to the next item on her agenda, as though the man hadn't spent 11 years building his career inside these walls. Send my assistant whatever files you have. Today, the boardroom held its breath the way it always did in her presence. A dozen executives who had learned, over 5 brutal years since she'd taken over as CEO, that Jane Monae did not tolerate excuses, did not tolerate emotional appeals, and absolutely did not tolerate failure delivered with a trembling voice. The fired man opened his mouth once more, closed it, walked out. Nobody at that table looked at each other. Nobody dared. Anything else? Jane asked the room, glancing up with the calm, faintly bored expression of a woman who had just ended someone's career the way other people ended a phone call. Nobody had anything else. Later, walking to her office, her chief of staff fell into step beside her, clearly weighing whether to speak at all. That's the 3rd department head this quarter, he said carefully. Then the other department heads should learn from his mistake, Jane said, not slowing her pace. I don't run a company on second chances. I run it on results. Understood. He hesitated. For what it's worth, the board's been asking questions. About morale. About turnover. Let them ask, Jane said, entering her office. The board can worry about morale. I'll worry about the company still existing in 10 years. Jane was sitting alone in her office. The city stretched beneath the floor-to-ceiling windows. Her assistant placed a folder on the desk. Your grandmother called. Jane didn't look up. What did she want? She asked whether you were coming to dinner tonight. No, Jane replied. Her assistant hesitated. There was something else. Jane looked up. What? She asked about Daniel. Her face hardened. What about him? She wanted to know whether your marriage is stable. She leaned back. Why? She didn't explain. Just then, her phone rang. Her grandmother's name appeared on the screen. Jane stared at it for several seconds before answering. What? Her grandmother's voice came through soft and measured. I heard you and Daniel are having problems. Who told you that? Does it matter? Yes. You sound defensive. I'm not. You've always been a terrible liar. Jane's fingers tightened around the phone. What do you want? I want you to remember that the Monae Group is bigger than your personal life. I know. Then act like it. Her eyes narrowed. Are you threatening me? No. I'm reminding you, her grandmother said and hung up. Jane sat at her office deep in thought. She never imagined herself living with a man 2 years earlier. Marriage had always seemed like a weakness to her. Something that gave another person access to the parts of you that could hurt. She had learned that lesson long before she became the CEO of the Monae Group. Her father had taught her, not through words, through silence, through unpredictable anger, through the way he could turn affection into punishment without warning. When Jane was 8, her mother had begged him not to leave. He had left anyway. When she was 11, he had returned. When she was 13, he had disappeared again. He hadn't just left. He'd taken almost everything with him. The family's savings, drained slowly without her mother's knowledge, funneled into a second life Jane's mother hadn't known existed until it was too late to stop any of it. Jane had watched her mother fall apart in slow motion, watched her stop eating properly, watched her sit by the phone for months, convinced he'd call, convinced there had been some mistake, convinced that the man who'd built an entire secret life for a year and a half was simply confused and would eventually remember the family he'd actually chosen. And he never called or visited. Jane's mother never fully recovered. She smiled less. She trusted no one. She spent the rest of her life, until the illness finally took her when Jane was 24, quietly, permanently altered. A woman who had loved completely and been destroyed for it. And Jane had learnt a bitter lesson from it. Never depend on anyone. Never give anyone enough power to hurt you. And most importantly, always be the one in control. That was why she had chosen Daniel. Not because he was powerful. Not because he challenged her. Not in a serious way. He was kind, patient, predictable, and most importantly, he needed her. That made Jane feel safe. At least that was what she told herself. She had met him 2 years ago at a mutual acquaintance's dinner party she'd only attended because her grandmother had insisted, and she noticed him almost immediately for the simple, novel reason that he didn't seem remotely interested in impressing her. You're wrong about the merger, he said, halfway through dinner, cutting into a conversation about a recent acquisition Jane's company had made headlines for. The synergy numbers your team published are optimistic to the point of fiction. I've seen the actual overlap in your supply chains. It's half what you're claiming. The table went quiet. Jane set down her fork, genuinely surprised for the first time in longer than she could remember. And you know this how exactly? I ran my family's logistics company for 6 years before it collapsed, Daniel said, without a trace of self-pity, simply stating a fact. Bad debt, bad timing, and a board that panicked at exactly the wrong moment. I know supply chain overlap when I see fabricated numbers dressed up to look like it. Your company collapsed, Jane repeated. And you're lecturing me about my numbers. I'm not lecturing. I'm correcting. He met her eyes, entirely unbothered by her tone, which was, in itself, remarkable. Most people flinched at that tone. You asked how I knew. I told you. Whether you like the answer is your business. Jane found herself, against every instinct honed over boardroom warfare, almost smiling. You know, she said, studying him with new interest. Most people at this table spent the last hour agreeing with everything I said. I noticed. Daniel took a sip of his wine, entirely unbothered by the sudden attention of the table. It seemed exhausting, honestly, watching everyone perform enthusiasm for opinions they clearly didn't hold. And you don't perform. I can't afford to. A humorless smile crossed his face. When your company collapses, you learn very quickly which version of yourself is actually useful and which version was just decoration for people who wanted to be flattered. I don't have the energy for decoration anymore. That's either very honest or very reckless. Telling a room full of investors that. Probably both. He met her eyes squarely. You asked a direct question about my numbers. I gave you a direct answer. If that costs me an invitation to future dinners, I'll survive it. Jane laughed, a short, surprised sound that drew curious glances from the rest of the table, because Jane Monae did not, as a rule, laugh at dinner parties. She did her research on him within the week. Daniel Hahn, 31, formerly the CEO of a mid-sized logistics firm his own father had built, now drowning in personal debt after the company's collapse, quietly working a job well beneath his qualifications simply to keep his creditors at bay. Intelligent, calm under pressure, according to every former colleague she quietly interviewed, and, crucially, utterly uninterested in her status, her money, or her name, the first man in years who had argued with her instead of agreeing with everything she said in the hope of currying favor. I have a proposal, Jane said, sitting across from Daniel in a private meeting room she'd rented specifically for the purpose. Her tone as clinical as any business negotiation she'd ever conducted. A 2-year marriage contract. Daniel blinked. I'm sorry. I'll clear your debts. All of them. I'll provide you with a home more luxurious than anything you've lived in since your company failed. She slid a folder across the table, thick with terms already drafted by her legal team. In exchange, you become my husband. Publicly, convincingly, at every family event and board function required. You'll also manage the household, meals, schedule, appearances, availability whenever I need you. You're describing a job, Daniel said slowly, flipping through the folder with an expression she couldn't quite read. I'm describing a contract that solves both our problems, Jane said. You need money. I need a husband my board and my grandmother will accept before they hand control of my company to someone else. This isn't romance, Daniel. This is a transaction between two people who understand exactly what they're getting. He was quiet for a long moment, studying the terms, studying her. And if I say no, then you keep drowning in debt, and I find someone else. Jane kept her voice level, though something in her chest tightened at the thought of him actually refusing. But I don't think you will say no. I've read your financials, Daniel. You have 4 months before your creditors take everything, including whatever's left of your father's name. Something flashed in his eyes. Not quite anger, something closer to recognition. The particular sting of hearing an uncomfortable truth stated without cruelty but also without a shred of softness. You're very direct, he said finally. I don't see the point in being anything else. He closed the folder, looked at her for a long, measuring moment. One condition, he said. You don't get to treat me like staff. Whatever this is, I'm not disappearing into some role you've assigned me. You work for me? Jane said, the words coming out sharper than she'd intended. An old defensive reflex she couldn't quite suppress. Don't confuse that with being my partner. This is business, Daniel. Nothing more. He held her gaze a moment longer, something unreadable passing behind his eyes. Fine, he said and signed. During the first year of their marriage, the arrangement had worked exactly as Jane had designed it to. Daniel managed the household with an efficiency that almost impressed her, though she was careful never to say so out loud. He cooked meals that appeared on the table at precisely the times she requested. He accompanied her to the necessary family functions, playing the role of devoted husband with a convincing warmth that fooled even her sharpest-eyed relatives. He waited up most nights, when she came home late from the office, though she rarely acknowledged it beyond a curt nod as she passed him in the hallway. She gave him a monthly allowance transferred automatically and treated every considerate gesture he made. The coffee left exactly the way she liked it, the dry cleaning collected without being asked, the quiet way he learned her patterns and adjusted around them, as something she had simply purchased. A service rendered. Nothing that required gratitude. You didn't have to reorganize the study, she told him once, finding her office space rearranged into something considerably more functional than the chaos she'd left it in. It was a mess, Daniel said simply, not looking up from the book he was reading. That wasn't a compliment. I don't need you making decisions about my space without asking. Daniel set the book down slowly and looked at her with something like genuine irritation crossing his face. I organized your study because you couldn't find a single document in it last week and it cost you an hour before a client call, he said evenly. I didn't do it for praise, Jane. I did it because it needed doing and I was the only one here to do it. You're here because I pay you, Jane said, the old defensive coldness rising in her like a reflex she couldn't stop even when she wanted to. Remember that. Something in Daniel's expression shuddered closed. He didn't argue. He simply nodded, picked his book back up, and said nothing more for the rest of the evening. Jane told herself the silence didn't bother her. It happened again, more sharply, the night of her grandmother's annual charity gala. Daniel had spent the afternoon arranging every detail of their appearance. The car, the seating, a brief, carefully rehearsed speech about how they'd met that would satisfy her relatives without revealing the truth. He performed all of it flawlessly, charming her aunts, deflecting her uncle's pointed questions about children with an ease that left Jane quietly astonished. In the car afterward, she said, without thinking, "You were good tonight." "Thank you," Daniel said. "I mean it as a compliment on the performance," Jane clarified quickly, as though warmth might be mistaken for something more dangerous. "You handled my uncle well." Daniel was quiet for a moment, looking out the window the way he often did when something she'd said had landed wrong. "You know," he said finally, "you could just say I did a good job and let that be the whole sentence. You don't have to remind me it was a performance every single time you almost say something kind." "I'm not trying to be unkind." "I know," he said. "That's almost worse." Jane didn't have an answer for that. She spent the rest of the ride in silence, turning his words over and over, unable to shake the discomfort of being so accurately read by a man she'd hired specifically because she believed he'd never have the power to see her clearly at all. With all these running through her mind, when she got home that evening, she simply stood at the living room, staring at the fireplace. "You're home early," Daniel said, walking towards the kitchen. "I need to ask you something," Jane said. Daniel stopped. "What? Are you happy?" Jane asked. He blinked. "What? Are you happy being married to me?" Jane repeated. Daniel studied her. "I don't know." She frowned. "That wasn't the answer I expected. You asked me a question. And I don't know." She walked closer. "Do you want to leave?" Daniel looked at her. "I've thought about it." Something inside Jane tightened. "When?" "Many times." "And why haven't you?" He took a breath. "Because I keep hoping you'll let me in." Jane looked down. "You wouldn't like what's inside." "You don't know that." "I do." Daniel stepped closer. "What happened to you?" She immediately pulled away. "Nothing." "Jane, nothing happened. You don't have to tell me everything." "I said nothing happened." He watched her for a moment. Then he nodded. "Okay." He turned to leave. Then slowly, without her fully realizing it was happening, Daniel stopped behaving like a man desperate for her approval. He developed his own routine, early mornings running along the river before she woke, evenings spent reading in the library rather than hovering, waiting for instructions she rarely gave anyway. He started making decisions about the household without asking her permission first, decisions that were, infuriatingly, almost always correct. He became genuinely friendly with her household staff in a way Jane never had in 5 years of employing them, knew the housekeeper's daughter was starting university, knew the driver's wife had just recovered from surgery, knew the chef's actual name, which Jane realized with quiet horror one evening that she did not. He even began managing parts of the house Jane hadn't realized were falling apart. A leaking pipe in the east wing she'd been ignoring for months. A garden that had gone untended since she'd fired the previous groundskeeper in a fit of impatience a year ago, quietly restored to something resembling life. And strangely, disturbingly, Jane began looking forward to coming home. She noticed it first as an absence. The odd hollowness of the evenings he had a rare night out with a friend from his old life. The way the penthouse felt too quiet, too still, without the low sound of him moving through the kitchen or the warm light spilling from the library where he read most nights. She noticed it fully one Tuesday when her driver asked, out of pure habit, whether she wanted to go straight to the office or home first, and Jane realized, with a jolt of something close to panic, that she had answered home without a single moment of hesitation. She did not examine that feeling closely. She had spent 17 years training herself not to. The night everything cracked began, appropriately, with everything else already breaking. A merger Jane had spent 8 months negotiating collapsed in a single afternoon meeting, the partner company's board voting unanimously against terms she had personally structured. By evening, 3 of her own board members had quietly begun circulating concerns about her judgment, concerns Jane recognized, with cold clarity, as the opening moves of a campaign to weaken her position before the next shareholder vote. She came home at nearly midnight and did not go to bed. Instead, she sat alone at the kitchen island in the dark, still in her work clothes, staring at nothing, feeling something crack open inside her chest that she had spent her entire adult life keeping welded shut. Daniel found her there an hour later. He didn't ask what was wrong. He didn't offer platitudes or reassurance she wouldn't have believed anyway. He simply moved through the kitchen, quiet and unhurried, and began preparing food. Something warm, something simple, the exact kind of meal her mother used to make on the rare good nights before everything fell apart, and set it in front of her without a word, then sat down across the island, close but not crowding her, and waited. The merger failed, Jane said finally, staring at the food rather than eating it. 8 months of work, gone in an afternoon. I heard, Daniel said quietly. I'm sorry. The board is already circling. They'll use this as an excuse to push for more oversight. Maybe worse. Her voice was flat, controlled, the way she'd trained it to be for 17 years, though something beneath it trembled now, just barely. Everyone is waiting for me to fail, Daniel. They've been waiting since the day I took over. Waiting for the moment I finally prove I can't hold all of this together alone. You've held it together for 5 years, Daniel said. One failed merger doesn't undo that. You don't understand. The words came out sharper than she intended, old wounds surfacing faster than she could control them. I can't afford to fail. I can't afford to need anyone to catch me if I do. My mother needed my father to be who he said he was, and when he wasn't, it destroyed her. I watched it happen. I watched her disappear a little more every single day for years, waiting for a phone call that never came. Her voice cracked, finally. I promised myself I'd never be her. I'd never build my entire life around someone who could just leave, take everything and walk out the door like it cost him nothing. Daniel was quiet for a long moment, watching her with an expression that held none of the pity she'd braced herself for. Then stop trying to control whether people stay, he said finally, gently but without hesitation. You can't build a wall high enough to guarantee nobody ever leaves, Jane. All you can do is build something worth staying for. Those aren't the same thing, and I think you've spent so long doing the first one that you've forgotten the second one exists. Jane's head snapped up, something defensive and wounded flaring in her chest. You don't understand what it's like. You don't know what it did to her, to us. You're right. I don't know exactly what it did to you, Daniel said, steady, not backing down from her anger, the way everyone else in her life had learned to. But I know what it's doing to you now. You've built a mansion full of people who are terrified to disappoint you, and you call that safety. It isn't safety, Jane. It's just a different kind of alone. Jane didn't respond. She couldn't. She stood, pushed the untouched food away, and retreated to her room without another word, her composure barely holding together until the door closed behind her. But his words didn't leave with her. They followed her into a sleepless night, and into the weeks that followed, refusing to be filed away and forgotten the way she filed away everything else that threatened her carefully constructed control. She never admitted, out loud, how much she had come to depend on him. Instead, in the weeks after that night in the kitchen, Jane did what she had always done with feelings too large and too frightening to name. She tried to control them into submission, and in doing so began controlling Daniel instead. "Where were you this afternoon?" she asked one evening, an edge of accusation in her voice that hadn't been there a month earlier. "The house was empty when I called. I had lunch with an old colleague," Daniel said, mild surprise crossing his face at her tone. "I mentioned it this morning. You didn't mention who. Does it matter? I like to know where you are," Jane said, and even as the words left her mouth she heard how strange they sounded, how far from the cold, transactional arrangement they'd started with. It escalated in small, insidious increments over the following weeks. She began questioning who he spoke to on the phone. She noticed, with a discomfort she refused to examine, exactly how long it took him to respond to her texts, and felt something tight and anxious coil in her chest on the rare occasions the response was delayed by more than a few minutes. She found herself, one evening, standing in the doorway of the library watching him laugh at something on his phone, and felt a flare of jealousy so sharp and unfamiliar that it frightened her more than the merger collapse ever had. "You're doing it again," Daniel said one night, setting down his book with the particular calm he used when he was about to say something she didn't want to hear. "Checking on me like I'm a flight risk. I'm not checking on you. You asked me 3 times today where I was going. You asked the driver to confirm my schedule without asking me first." His voice wasn't accusatory, just tired. The tone of a man who had been carefully watching a pattern form and had finally decided to name it. "Jane, I need you to hear something, and I don't think you're going to like it. Then don't say it. You didn't marry me because you wanted a husband," Daniel said anyway, quiet and steady, cutting straight through 17 years of careful architecture in a single sentence. "You married me because you wanted someone you couldn't lose, someone whose debts made him grateful enough to never leave. And now that I'm actually here, actually staying, you don't know what to do with the fact that you can't fully control it. So you're trying to control me instead, the same way you control everything else in your life that scares you." Jane stood frozen, because he was right. He was completely right, and she didn't have a single clever, controlled response ready to deflect it. "That's not," she started and stopped, because the lie wouldn't come. "Isn't it?" Daniel's voice was gentle, but it didn't relent. "Think about it, Jane. Every man you dated before me, you told me yourself, brief, efficient, gone the moment they wanted more than you were willing to give. You chose them because they'd never get close enough to hurt you. And then you chose me because I was drowning in debt, because you thought a man who needed saving could never be the one who does the leaving. But you never once asked whether I wanted to be saved on those terms. You just assumed gratitude would keep me in place the way money keeps everyone else in your life in place. That's not fair." "Maybe not," he admitted. "But it's true, and I think you know it's true, or you wouldn't be standing there unable to argue with me." Daniel watched her struggle for a response that didn't arrive, something sad and resolved settling into his expression. "I'm not staying because a contract requires it," he said quietly. "I stopped needing your money to feel like staying was worth it months ago. But I'm not going to spend the rest of the year being treated like property you're afraid of losing. That's not a marriage, Jane. That's just a very expensive cage, and I think you built it for both of us without ever meaning to." He left the room before she could find the words to answer him, and Jane sat alone in the sudden silence, more frightened than she had been in 17 years. The betrayal, when Daniel discovered it, had nothing to do with money at all. He found the extended contract by accident. A legal document Jane's assistant had left on the kitchen counter, meant for her signature, outlining a 3-year extension to their original 2-year arrangement, quietly drafted and nearly finalized weeks earlier without a single word to him about it. He was still holding it when Jane came home that evening. "You extended it," he said, before she'd even set down her bag, the document held up between them like an accusation. "Without telling me, without asking me. You just decided the way you decide everything, and expected me to simply go along with it because that's what the contract says I do." "Daniel, I can explain." "Explain what?" His voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight she'd never heard from him before, something final settling into it. That you were so afraid of me leaving when the year ended that you tried to legally obligate me to stay instead of just asking me? Instead of trusting me enough to have an actual conversation about what either of us wanted. I didn't know how to ask, Jane said, and the honesty of it startled even her. I didn't know how to ask without admitting that She stopped, unable to finish the sentence, fighting against the truth trying to surface. That you what, Jane? Daniel's voice cracked, just slightly, the first sign of real emotion breaking through his own composure. Finish the sentence. For once, just finish it. She couldn't. The words sat trapped behind years of scar tissue, and by the time she found the courage to reach for them, Daniel had already turned away, already walking toward the door with the quiet, devastating finality of a man who had given someone every chance to be honest with him and had run out of chances to give. I'm not leaving because of the money, he said, pausing at the door, not quite looking back at her. I want you to understand that. I'm leaving because you never trusted me enough to choose me freely. You just trapped me in a contract the same way you trap everyone in your life who gets close enough to matter. And I can't keep living inside someone else's fear, Jane, no matter how much I've come to care about the person underneath it. He left. The door closed behind him. Not slammed, just closed, quiet and final. And Jane stood in the sudden emptiness of the penthouse with the terrible realization that the sound was identical to the one that had ended her childhood 17 years earlier. For the first time in longer than she could remember, Jane Monae had no control over someone's decision, and the panic that followed was unlike anything her carefully ordered life had ever prepared her for. Her first instinct was to have her lawyers draft a breach of contract notice, to send security to track his location, to do something, anything that would restore the illusion of control she'd built her entire adult identity around. She got as far as picking up the phone before she stopped. She sat alone in the too-quiet penthouse, phone in hand, and understood with a clarity that felt almost violent that ordering Daniel back would only prove exactly what he'd accused her of. That she couldn't tolerate losing control over someone she cared about. That she would rather cage him than risk the vulnerability of letting him choose freely and possibly choose to leave. So, for the first time in her life, she did something completely foreign to every instinct she'd spent 17 years cultivating. She put the phone down. She let him go. She found Daniel 3 days later, staying in a modest apartment borrowed from the same colleague he'd once had lunch with, the kind of ordinary, unglamorous space that couldn't have been further from the penthouse she'd built her entire identity around. He opened the door and simply looked at her. Jane said, before he could speak, before her nerve could fail her the way it had failed her every other time this conversation had almost happened. I'm here to apologize. Daniel walked inside and left her standing at the center of the room, while he sat and watched her. I am sorry for my actions towards you and the things I said. I was scared and the feelings felt new to me. So I did what I could to protect myself, and I didn't consider you Daniel. I have heard you, Daniel said plainly. Are you coming back with me? She asked. No. The contract isn't over yet, and I know that you do not have the money to pay for the breach of agreement. So why don't you come back first, and we will talk about it as time goes. Jane said, reaching the door and turning back to looking at him. That's the problem I have with you, Jane. You think you can control everybody. Just a few minutes ago you were apologizing, and now you are saying contract and agreement. Well, allow me worry about the money for breach of agreement myself. Have a nice day. Jane. Daniel shut the door. Jane drove to her grandmother's home looking like a little girl whose world had just fallen. Sad and lost. She cried in her grandmother's laps with tears falling so freely that she didn't think of stopping them. I built my entire life to make sure I'd never be her, Grandmother Jane said amidst tears. Instead, I became the person who did it to her. I have lost him, Grandma. She continued. Calm down, my child, her grandmother said. Do you think he will come back? Oh, what will the board say or do? I don't know whether Daniel will come back, Jane, and neither do you. That's the part you must finally learn to accept. He left for good, Grandmother. I tried to control him. I tried to extend the contract without his permission when I could have just asked him to stay. Jane said, still crying. I told you, child, but you always insisted that you didn't want to become like your mother, forgetting that there was your father also. I loved your mother very much, Jane. I watched what he did to her too. Her grandmother's voice softened, just slightly, the closest thing to gentleness. But you cannot spend your whole life punishing every man who might disappoint you for the sins of one who already did. That isn't strength. It's just a different kind of surrender. So, I became the person I hated the most. Grandmother. Give Daniel some time, Jane, her grandmother said, patting her back. It was 2 weeks later that Jane went back to Daniel's. I'm not here to demand you come back, Jane said, before he could speak. Before her nerve could fail her the way it had failed her every other time this conversation had almost happened. She held out the extended contract and the original one beneath it and tore them both in half in front of him, then in half again, the same way she'd once torn apart every business deal that failed to meet her terms. Except this time the tearing wasn't an act of power. It was an act of surrender. I'm not offering you money anymore, she said, her voice shaking in a way she hadn't allowed anyone to hear in 17 years. I'm not offering you a house, or an allowance, or a role to play at family events. I have nothing left to offer you except the truth, which is that I fell in love with you somewhere between the contract and the kitchen, and I was too afraid of that truth to ever say it honestly. Daniel didn't move, didn't speak, watching her with careful, guarded hope. I'm asking you to choose, Jane continued. Not because a contract requires it. Not because of the breach of agreement. Just choose, freely. Even knowing you could choose to walk away and I'd have no power to stop you. And if I choose to leave? Daniel asked quietly, testing the weight of the offer. Jane's throat tightened, the old fear rising, fighting against everything in her. Then I'll survive it, she said, and meant it. For the first time in her life truly meaning it. It'll hurt more than almost anything I've survived before. But I won't build another cage to avoid finding out. I'd rather love you and lose you than keep you and never actually have you at all. Something shifted in Daniel's expression. The first, real, unguarded softening she'd seen since the night he'd walked out the door. That's the first time, he said slowly. You've ever sounded like you actually meant something you said to me. Daniel didn't come back that day. He needed time, he told her honestly, standing in the doorway of the small borrowed apartment. Time to trust that the woman standing in front of him wasn't simply performing vulnerability the way she'd once performed a marriage for her board and her grandmother. Time to be certain that the change was real and not another version of control dressed up as surrender. Jane didn't argue. For the first time in her life, she simply accepted the answer without trying to negotiate a better one. He came to her 3 weeks later on a quiet evening without warning and found her in the penthouse kitchen. The same kitchen where he'd once found her broken at midnight. The same island where he'd once fed her without asking a single question. If I come back, he said, standing in the doorway, I don't want to be your house husband. I don't want a contract. I don't want a role. I want to be your partner, in every sense of the word, or I don't want to come back at all. Jane looked at him, and for the first time in 17 years, felt something in her chest unclench completely. Then don't be my house husband, she said, a real smile breaking across her face, unguarded and entirely without calculation. Be my husband. No contract required. He crossed the kitchen and kissed her, and this time, neither of them was performing anything for anyone at all. Months later, Jane came home from a brutal 14-hour day, the kind that would once have sent her straight to her office to review numbers alone until midnight. Needing no one and expecting nothing from the house, she returned to accept silence and order. Instead, for the first time in her life, she walked through the door not expecting anyone to serve her. She found Daniel in the kitchen, cooking, humming something low and off-key to himself, entirely unbothered by her presence rather than waiting anxiously for instructions. She wrapped her arms around herself for a moment, just watching him, something warm and unfamiliar settling into her chest. Long day, Daniel asked, glancing over his shoulder with a smile that held none of the careful distance of their first year together. Very, Jane admitted. He gestured toward the table, already set for two. Dinner's ready. Jane sat, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she didn't feel like a CEO reviewing the day's failures. She didn't feel like an heiress managing a household of people paid to make her comfortable. She didn't feel like a woman who had to control every variable in every room she entered simply to feel safe. She simply felt safe. Fully, freely, without a single contract or condition attached to it. Jane Monae had spent 17 years believing she needed a husband she could control. Someone indebted enough, dependent enough, grateful enough to guarantee he'd never walk out the door the way her father once had. What she had actually needed all along was someone she could trust enough to let walk away, and who chose freely and completely to stay anyway. She had finally, after 17 years, found him. Not by building a cage strong enough to hold him, but by tearing the cage apart and discovering, to her own quiet astonishment, that he was still standing there when the door finally, truly opened. We have come to the end of this story. Thank you for staying with us. Was Jane too controlling to Daniel? Or was her actions justified? Do let us know in the comments. Also, do not forget to subscribe, like, share, and comment. See you in the next video.